Right. Hello, everybody. We're going to get started now. My name is Moritz Bierling. I'm kind of helping out with the emceeing for the afternoon in this room, the Blueberry Room. So if you see other talks later on, I'll be also here. And if you have questions, feel free to come over and ask me. The next speaker is Harry Pottash. He's going to be speaking on the mutable mythologies of money. Take it away.
All right, great. And thank you so much. I really appreciate your setting everything up. It's hugely helpful. All right, guys. So I'd really like this to be sort of a little bit more interactive, especially in the big rooms. There's a manageable number of us. I think having it kind of come as more of a discussion is going to be a lot more fun and a lot more interesting. So I'm going to talk about kind of some of the weird mythologies that underpin money, that make money work. And then more than anything, I'm just going to go through a bunch of different currencies or things that sometimes people think of in the same terms as money, and talking about what some of their traits are and what some of their myths are. So the first question I want to address is, why is money useful? Not to an individual, but like, why is it something that is sort of helpful for a society? Why does it tend to not go away once you have it? And my answer, oh god, that's terrible. All right, so coordination of effort. Also, apparently all of my little text slides have been re-rendered by Windows into black on black. So it's okay, it's mostly a picture show, mostly I'm talking. So the big advantage of money to a society is it's a great way of coordinating effort, right? It's kind of a pneumatic system that allows large groups of people to work together. There are other ways of coordinating effort. One of the big ones is hierarchy. You can coordinate large groups of people with hierarchy. Dogma is another really effective way. So laws, religious beliefs, rules, customs. So the other question is, what is the central myth of money? The one like critical thing that you need to believe about money and people need to believe about it for it to work, right? Because it's just little pieces of paper or bits or something, right? It's not inherently functional. And in my opinion, the core myth about money that needs to work is that everybody needs to believe that everybody else wants it. If you don't believe that other people want your money, then it doesn't work. And that's got to be a common belief, right? So you need to know it, and you need to know that everyone else knows it. There's an interesting side effect of that, because if everybody wants money, it also means that you need almost everybody in your society to feel like they're kind of poor, right? It means that everyone's got to have that sort of clawing desire for more money. And if everyone doesn't feel a little bit poor, at least, then the whole money thing stops working, and you end up with a very different looking society, something more like a honor culture, or a very traditional, like Buddhist monks don't really feel the need for money and don't really use it. So pretty much every single cryptocurrency presentation starts off by talking about the different traits of money that they're going to talk about. I was watching Silicon Valley as it aired, and I was like, oh look, it's my presentation. I choose to use 9. There's not an official number. I'm going to just kind of buzz through these really quickly. If there are any questions about any of them, please slow me down, raise a hand, and I'd love to have discussions. There are some really interesting ways to drill into them. But acceptability, I think we all know what this means. People take it. Portability, right? Gold is heavy. Actually, gold used to be a really good form of portability back when technology was a little less developed. So a lot of these things are moving targets. Now we consider gold not portable, right? Divisibility, right? Like, you should be able to subdivide it. Recognizability. You should be able to tell when it's a real thing pretty easily, right? So US currency is pretty recognizable. Fungibility. One piece of the thing should be interchangeable for another. If I have a $100 bill and you have a $100 bill, I'm happy to swap them, it doesn't matter to me, right? If I have a Honda and you have a Honda, we're not happy to swap them. Durability. It's nice if your money doesn't just sort of break down while you're holding it. Difficulty to produce, right? There's a problem if it's too easy to make the money. This is kind of the bead economy that was present in the United States before Westerners showed up. When they talk about tribesmen trading things for glass beads, there was actually large regions where beads were the currency, and they were just difficult to produce. And then Westerners showed up who had a technology for producing glass beads really easily, and all of a sudden it was like, oh, they showed up with like stacks of $100 bills, right? So difficult to produce is a good thing. Theft resistant, right? This is actually one of the more interesting ones because you kind of want it to be both theft resistant and seizure resistant, right? So you don't want some random criminal to be able to steal it from you easily, but you also generally don't want the government or legitimate authorities to just be able to take it away. But those two things play against each other. So if something is very easy to seize, like say your bank account, if someone steals it from you, then you just petition the government, they go, oh yeah, that's totally illegitimate, and seize it and give it back, right? But it is possible to do both of those things. And then finally, stability of value, right? It's sort of messy if prices move 10% in a day, which is topical now. So I also have a sort of cast of characters who I have commentaries from. There's sort of the common mythology of money, the one that people who are not thinking about that particular type of currency hold, right? I use Homer Simpson to say that. That's sort of the dollar is a dollar outlook. There's a sort of trader viewpoint who's got a very, very detailed mechanical knowledge of the underlying myth of money and how all of its details work, but he doesn't really question it. He's just using it to try and get as much money as he can, right? And then there's this sort of philosopher-stoner approach where he's just like, hey, it's all just pieces of green paper, man, right? Which is pretty much where I am. Okay, so the kind of granddaddy of money is gold, right? And I'm going to use these spider charts through the whole thing, right? So this is basically an area chart. It's got one of each of the traits along each axis, and then you can kind of see how well it does as a general purpose currency by how big the blob it makes is. You can also see where it's weak or strong.
What are the bottom two?
Yeah, so at the bottom, this is durability, and this is fungibility. And I'm sorry about the slide issue. Teach me to export to PowerPoint. Or at least do it without checking. Right? So gold is great. Like I said, portability has been a moving target. It used to be up top for portability, right? It used to be one of the more portable things you could use as a store of value. But it's huge. If you look at that, it almost takes up the whole spider chart, right? It's really durable. It's really, it's seizure resistant. You can bury it in your backyard, etc. I'm also going to just try and fly through these so we can have a longer Q&A session, right? So gold is great. Sometimes you'll hear people say that it has intrinsic value, right? You make electronics and stuff with it. That's pretty much not true. Gold doesn't, I mean, it does have some intrinsic value in electronics, but it's valued way above that. All right, so the next one up is the US dollar, right? Circa like 1900 to 1950. Before that, we had bimetallic backing. It was very complicated. But we went to a gold-backed dollar in 1900, right? People seem to think that it was gold-backed forever before Nixon. That's totally not true. It's changed what it was many times. A gold-backed dollar kind of makes a lot of sense. They're saying gold is the granddaddy of currency. Here's just a piece of paper that says, I'll give you some money for it, right? Should be bulletproof. The problem is that several times, almost like clockwork, every 25 or 30 years, they ended up changing the amount of gold that your dollar was backed by, right? So the deal keeps changing. It's an interesting myth, right? The myth is that the money is worth a certain amount of gold that's held, but you have to trust the person who's holding the gold and conducting the exchange. So then we had the Bretton Woods Accord, right? So basically after World War II, a whole bunch of different countries got together and agreed to fix all of their currencies to a gold-backed currency, right? And fix them relative to each other. And the net result of that was a really stable currency because you couldn't just repeg it whenever you wanted to, right? Because there were a bunch of other treaty members who got upset at that. It's a little bit like the euro, but totally not. Also created the IMF as a side effect, which meant that not only was your money backed by gold, right, pretty much exactly as the common man thought it was, but also your loans were backed by a large institution, which made large-scale fiscal stability work a lot better. That worked for a while until some other things sort of spun out of control. The modern US dollar, right, under Nixon, I bet a lot of people know this. Under Nixon, it switched to not being gold-backed anymore. It's just a free-floating dollar. The dollar is worth what we say it's worth because it is. So again, you see the production challenge goes down a whole lot, right? Because now you don't have to have gold to make it. And stability of value goes down a bit. So it's been pretty stable. So what actually makes a US dollar worth something? In my opinion, yeah, basically. So it's sort of a two-factor thing, right? There's a guy with some really big guns, right, Uncle Sam, and also he collects taxes in it, right? So there's always one person who wants your money.
And issues bonds.
Yes, which is basically another flavor of similar currency.
Well, it's more relevant for the non-taxpayers.
Right. So there's always a buyer for US currency. In some cases, he's buying it by not throwing you in prison or not giving it to him.
What about petroleum? Petroleum.
So are you talking about just the general concept of the petrodollar?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I would say that is true, but that's sort of operating at an additional level of like overlaid complexity. And let's bring that back up at the end. All right, so then there's the myth of the US dollar bank account, right? You put your money in the bank in the US somewhere. This sort of naive view of that, and you can see I put it like all the way down on theft resistance because if the government wants to seize your bank account, it's just done, right? I don't know if any of you have ever tried to cash out or cash in large amounts of cryptocurrency, but it's a frightening experience sometimes. The sort of simple view of that is you put your money in the bank and the bank holds your money and it's just sort of there, right? It's a account backed by a US dollar. You pretty quickly realize that it's actually fractional reserve banking. They only hold 10% of what you give them and they just really hope that you don't all come and take your money out at the same time. And then there's a government institution backing that further. Stock is something that sometimes people think of as currency or a currency alternative. It's not a bad investment, right? The myth is that you own some of the company, but you can kind of see how it ends up not fulfilling a lot of the like liquidity desirable traits of money, right? It's kind of a small thing. You can't subdivide it. It's got problems with divisibility, acceptability. Most people won't take it. The company can just print more. But the common myth of it, which is that you own a fraction of the company, is actually pretty close to true. Like as you drill through it, it's not that far off. the value of it is totally not derived from that. And there's this sort of interesting myth that the market is highly functional and that things are valued almost exactly correctly, right? Anyone who tells you that you should buy, just buy an index fund because you can't outguess the market is sort of saying that. In reality, the market is not an efficient market, right? I don't know if any of you were paying attention recently when Long Island Iced Tea renamed themselves the Long Blockchain Company and immediately tripled in value. And then like it took another couple of months for everyone to figure it out and it immediately like dropped catastrophically in value. And then they're getting kicked off the NASDAQ for that stunt now. Yeah, or at least it's like the third time they're trying to kick them off the NASDAQ for that stock. It's in courts. Right, like that kind of stunt works totally well. Markets are not efficient. They are efficient in maybe the very long run, possibly, but there's a lot of fun there. All right, so diamonds. I feel like diamonds are worth mentioning because this is a really great case where the myth is like traceable and manufactured, right? So diamonds are thought to be, diamonds are forever. They're thought to be extremely durable. They're actually not durable at all. You can throw one in a fire and it burns, right? It's made out of carbon. Their value was specifically and intentionally manufactured by the De Beers family, right? I think a lot of people know this. In reality, diamonds are incredibly easy to produce now. And if you buy one and then try and sell it back, it loses 80% of its value immediately, right? I actually often wonder if that's sort of the greatest scam that was ever pulled. Black pearls are sort of similar deal. They were worthless until someone marketed them well. Diamonds are also not fungible and in general would make a terrible currency. So now I want to just sort of start talking about some interesting fiat currency edge cases. First of which is the Zimbabwe dollar. I have been to Zimbabwe and picked up a few souvenirs. Hyperinflation is a real thing. Governments overprint their currency all the time. Zimbabwe went a little bit farther with it than most countries go before they bail out. They actually got up to $100 trillion notes. I have the whole sequence. It's one of my like fun collector's pieces. But once the common man sort of stops believing that your money is valuable, it just tanks at an unbelievable speed. So the Argentinian Peso, this is not true anymore, but about 3 years ago it was true. They were having a hyperinflation problem, and their solution was to simply say, okay, it's illegal to not trade the peso at $1 to 8 pesos. And what ended up happening is they ended up with what they called the blue rate, which is everyone understood that the floating rate of the peso was not what they were legally required to trade it at. And I also was in Buenos Aires at the time when they were doing this. And it was really weird, right? If you went into any formal institution, if you went to a bank or anything like that, you'd be forced to use this horrible conversion rate. They wouldn't take pesos back for dollars, right? But you could walk into like a department store, and in the back of the department store there would be an illegal bank, which looked exactly like a bank, right? Tellers, like money counters, security guard, totally legit looking. That was a blue rate bank, and they would change your money at the blue rate, which was about 13 to 1. It also meant that there was clearly credit card infrastructure in the entire country, and everyone refused to use it. There was horrible shortages on cash. The whole economy was a mess. I don't know if you remember the discussion a little bit earlier today on some countries eventually moving to cryptocurrency, just sort of de facto, but a situation like this would have been a really obvious one. They had moved to the US dollar, just sort of de facto. Also, Zimbabwe moved to the US dollar just sort of de facto. Yes, Jordan.
So Cuba and to a lesser extent China both have had tiered currency situations as well. Like in Cuba, there's sort of explicit external versus internal currencies, and you couldn't really take the internal currency and then convert to US dollars. You could spend it domestically, and then you had to have a special kind of currency if you want to actually like change money and go out.
Yeah, this actually happens shockingly often, right? Each of these are just kind of categorical examples of something that happens a lot. Cuba does this, China does this. Sort of South Korea, though it's more like money movement laws, which if you've ever noticed, like on the cryptocurrency exchanges, there's often a huge gap between what the Koreans are paying for a currency and what the US is, or everyone else is really. That's because of that. France had this happen at one point, though that was pre-World War II. So this happens, right? And hyperinflation happens. And basically, I do see a sort of world where cryptocurrency will be sitting there when these things happen and kind of de facto slide in. Because central governments do weird things. I don't know if any of you have followed recently the demonetization thing in India. This was literally in December, right? This was November, December, just, what is that, 6 months ago? So this is an interesting one because it's an indication of like how hierarchy and money interplay and how fiat money is just sort of an expression of hierarchy in a lot of ways. Literally, overnight, well, I guess it more or less overnight, right? Overnight in November, middle of November, they sort of declared all $1,000 or all 1,000 rupee and 500 rupee bills are no longer going to be money. You have to turn them all into a bank right now, right? As of December, we won't even take them at the banks. It's just gone, right? They didn't have the infrastructure to make that sort of exchange. They didn't have the bills to replace them. You were only allowed to withdraw bills at a like really slow rate. I think it was 2,000 rupees a day. My wife knows. 2,000 rupees a day. And what's worse than that, they were also talking about doing a bail-in for the banks. You probably know what the phrase of a bail-out is, where a bank becomes insolvent and the government loans them a ton of money. A bail-in is where a bank becomes insolvent and the government says, you know what, it's okay, you can just take your depositors' money and use that to make yourself solvent again, right? So demonetization is a thing, and what do you think would happen if they had just said, you know what, gold is no longer money, you have to turn your gold into the bank, it doesn't work anymore. Nope. They did that, right? Like, they do that all the time. It doesn't work. Because money has value that's not derived from government statement and wanting to collect taxes in it. All right, so on to the cryptocurrencies. Bitcoin around 2012, and this is an interesting thing, right? Because the mythology that underpins money changes. The same way the US had a different mythology, the like gold-backed mythology in 1900 than it did in 1990. Bitcoin had a drastically different mythology in 2012 than it does now, right? In 2012, the mythology was all about the sort of crypto-anarchist dream that we were talking about before. Totally unregulatable, a way to fight back against big government, et cetera, right? Basically, no one accepted it. The value was also still not stable then, right? The price fluctuations were still there. It just swung between like $5 and $6 instead of $15,000 and $20,000. So it is pretty cool. It was cool then. Now in 2018, it's getting really much more acceptable, right? I mean, even when people won't take Bitcoin directly, there are a lot of interface layers that kind of let you get to it and spend it. It's got most of the same traits it's still not stable in value. It's also, you know, as I would put it, it's a poorly regulated, highly volatile asset with no obvious oversight and lots of uninformed investors, right? It's basically a giant piranha tank right now. We can talk about Ethereum in 2015. Ethereum was still pretty much just a new pipe dream kind of thing. The myth was it was going to be a totally immutable online ecosystem for new currencies. What was really interesting is the immutability myth of cryptocurrencies kind of got challenged in Ethereum. I don't know if any of you know very much about the DAO hack and the subsequent hard fork, but this is one of those really fascinating things because it came right down to the bare bones of like money being a way of coordinating effort and an underlying mythology. When someone stole enough Ethereum in one go, the community said, all right, so it's only immutable to the extent that we aren't all willing to just like pretend that didn't happen collectively. And everyone organized collectively, well, almost everyone organized collectively. There was a small contingent of Ethereum Classic holdouts and said, you know what, we can just fix this by rewriting history. And that's actually really cool. It challenges the underlying assumption of how that works, right? So the other interesting thing with that is Ethereum had that whole you can spin up a token in like 10 minutes process. I actually was going to do that in the workshop, but decided it was maybe a little too big. But people sort of went, oh, if it's just a sort of consensus basis and anyone can make a currency, I'll make a currency too, right? And so come 2018, Ethereum is a little bit more acceptable, but it has spawned an ocean of shitcoins, right? Everybody's got their own currency, and most of them are really awful. Because it takes 10 minutes to do, and people have confused can do it and get by it. All right, so one other one I want to talk about is Tether, right? You heard some mention of a stable coin, or the idea that stability is a really desirable asset in value. There are 3 ways you can accomplish that. The previous presentation this morning was only talking about one of them. The most basic way to make a stable coin is to just have it be a backed asset. The mythology behind Tether is that there is a bank account somewhere that has, you know, $1 for every Tether that's been issued, right? We don't know whether that bank is theoretically using fractional reserve accounting or not, because the problem with the Tether system is that no one can audit those banks because the people holding it won't let them. Actually, there are a couple of problems. Also, even assuming that they do have all that money in bank accounts and it was auditable, it's still then totally controlled by a central point, can be seized, right? So theft resistance goes right back down to 0 and has all sorts of similar problems. And then, besides Tether, the other one that's sort of worth mentioning in the stablecoin realm, right? Because it's nice to not have to transact in a massively fluctuating currency, is DAI, which is, you'll sometimes hear it referred to as MakerDAO, which is the sort of parent company. DAI is sort of the same idea as Tether, right? Only they've got a kind of clever way of using smart contracts and totally decentralized, making a set of value where you back it with Ethereum, and then it guards against fluctuations in value of Ethereum through, you know, what is essentially a tranching system, right? sort of like the same way that there was a tranching system with the 2008 asset crashes, though it's a much simpler one. And I would actually say that DAI has most of, right, the only real thing it's missing at the moment is acceptability as far as being a almost completely spider chart filling currency for the modern era. There's not really a lot of way to make a ton of money off of DAI, right? Because it's a stable coin, so it doesn't fluctuate wildly. But it's pretty valuable. And then here I just have a spider chart comparing some of the big ones that I've talked about, right? You can see sort of gold up there that's not very portable in gold, and Bitcoin, and that's really weak on stable value. And then the US dollar, which has a bunch of problems in the theft-resistant production challenge area. And then DAI in red, that's just not accepted anywhere.
Hey, DAI is stable with respect to what?
DAI is pegged to the dollar, but the way they set it up and also their announced intent is that anyone can issue it will issue a basket of different stable coins that are pegged to different things. So
that's how DAI is actually more stable than US dollars?
Yes.
That's what they started?
Right.
Okay.
So you can peg DAI, so they will have a gold peg DAI. It'll use the same mechanism. It will always move in parity with gold. You can have etc. And then also it's worth sort of pointing out that the US dollar is not super ridiculously stable. We also don't know how stable DAI will actually be because it's got to withstand some much larger fluctuations, but it did handle a 70% crash in underlying asset without really hiccuping, which is really good, right? Like that, you know, I mean, the US dollar can't do that. Nothing I know of anywhere else has done that. Yeah?
Do you have all the area numbers for all those spider charts?
I do not, and part of the reason why is all of the numbers for the various scales I just pulled out of my butt. So deriving second order statistics from them seems sort of underproductive. Yeah?
Can you just clarify that statement you just made about the US dollar can't handle that? Can't handle what?
I would say that my guess is that it's the underlying value propositions behind the US dollar, which in this case would probably be the US economy or the US military structure, fell by 70% over a week. The US dollar would probably not hold steady in value.
Then neither would DAI.
What does it mean for that to fall by 70%?
That's a much messier question in the case of the US dollar, right? Because the US dollar is mostly derived, in my opinion, it derives a lot of its value from the ability of the US government to collect taxes in it. That's why people tend to want it. Or at least it's the sort of desirer of last resort. So I would say the US economy, right? Or the US projected tax revenues, yeah. I'm not going to go to the mat for that definition. Almost everything in this presentation is sort of a starting point for conversation rather than a like deeply thought out thing.
We have a couple of minutes.
Great. So I was really hoping to get some good conversation going, and I totally don't mean to shut down what might be a really interesting, picky argument, which I totally want to have, because I think that's where a lot of things come out of. Anyone have any questions about diamonds or area charts or multi-tiered currency?
I have a question. So you mentioned previously, like when you were making the argument for Bitcoin, that one way that you get acceptability is kind of infrastructure or related services around it. So even if you can't pay for something in Bitcoin, you can now sort of do it because there are other mechanisms that kind of get you there. Does that sort of, so if that's the case, assuming that kind of this infrastructure around acceptability keeps growing, does that sort of, are there some of these axes that you sort of get from technology, do you think? Or,
Oh, totally, right? Like, I mean, portability comes almost entirely from technology.
Wrong way to say, I guess, in a way, you could just say that the acceptability axis is a short-term problem for all cryptocurrencies. Is one way to say it, right?
Right.
Eventually, they all go to like the max that you could get in these categories. Is that?
So right. The question is, I guess there's a couple questions wrapped up in there. One of the questions is, and I'm repeating it for the web audience, is acceptability a short-term problem for all of the cryptocurrencies? I would say yes, totally. It's a short-term problem for almost all currencies, almost all of the time, right? Until it's sort of the de facto currency, until people trust it, it's not accepted, right? Sometimes even past then, right? Gold has an acceptability problem as well. If I go to 7-Eleven with a gold coin, they stare at me blankly. So the second question is, does technology move past that in a lot of ways, right? Does this sort of technological middlemen produce acceptability? And I would say in a lot of ways it does, right? In a sufficiently advanced market, whether it's kind of digital technology or whether it's just like having a really flexible assets market that can do a lot of fancy transformations and is running quickly, it does produce that liquidity, right? So I think that's what people mean when they talk about liquidity. So for instance, the Apple stock, which I said was a terrible currency because it had low acceptability, sort of works for that because you know you can sell it on the open market and move it to money and then spend that money on a house, right? So the guy won't give you a house for Apple stock, but you can get there. And you can get there pretty quickly because it's a liquid market. Conversely, something that is relatively illiquid doesn't have that. I'm trying to think of a good illiquid asset. Yeah, classic cars are a great example. If you might have a beautiful old T-Bird or something valuable, and you can sell it eventually, but you can't get the house when you want it. Okay? Yes? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so what I learned from this is the way that you talked about and didn't talk about security is really interesting. Theft resistance, your theft resistance axis seems to be into the idea of like bank robbing. Whereas what you didn't mention, which is super interesting, made you realize that it's one of the key issue here. It's also like working professionally right now, or at least part of the movement, is that like cryptocurrencies, it's sort of like it forces individuals to have to enact bank level security, and so theft resistance sort of is converted from like an institutional problem to an individual problem, which is super interesting. So like I'm actually not sure that Bitcoin instance ranks highly, where it's like it sort of depends on the case. And then the other thing that cryptocurrency adds to the equation, which is kind of interesting, is like is also institutional security questions. So we could say the US dollar is somewhat well, there's something in between theft resistance and stability, which is basically like resistance to interference from state level actors.
Right.
And that would be fun to talk about.
Yeah, so I kind of, when I got most of the way through this, realized that I should break theft resistance out into two different lines, but that they would, I kind of kept going back and forth on that because of what you just said. They're almost always going to flip back and forth. You need to institute bank level security on your person. I would actually say it's closer to instituting cash level security on your person, right? If you've got a $100 bill or a gold coin, it is still not secure against theft in the ways you're talking about, right? But you don't need bank level security, you just sort of need the appropriate amount of risk tolerance.
You kind of do because you have scalable security exploits. So like,
right.
You can't rob 100,000 homes at the same time, but you can.
Okay, I would argue
my wallet is not internet connected.
Right, Right. So
Yeah.
I would say that I use a physical hard physical wallet.
Yeah.
Before that, I used paper wallets.
I mean, that's your proverbial mother.
Right, and she certainly doesn't right now. And ultimately, I have it all backed up on paper wallets. They're sitting in a bank, so
Yeah.
so there's the bank level security again. But yeah, it's a major concern. And then, so mostly my chart revealed how hard it is for state level actors to seize it. So I want to go to you because you.
I just want to see if you could break down acceptability versus recognizability. I can't see how something would be acceptable without also being recognizable.
Okay, so if I were to try and spend, how about Japanese yen with you right now, the problem would be, you might be pretty willing to accept them, right? Like if I was like, hey, I just got back from Japan, I don't have any cash on me, can you just like take this, right? You're like, oh yeah, the yen is a totally acceptable currency, but you've just never seen it before.
Okay, got it.
And you're like, yeah, looks legit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think cryptocurrency
So no, not at all, right? For me.
Add programmability, right? Add different elements.
Yeah, you can totally add desirable traits to these. These 9 traits are not like some great canonical thing passed down through generations, much like the values I put on them. I just kind of pulled them out of my ear. This is getting gradually more PG as I go. So yeah, I think we expect our money to do more and more things, and that this spider chart keeps growing. And the same way I was talking, gold used to be incredibly portable, right? You were like, oh wow, I just need like 1 brick of this and I can move like several villages worth of output, in my moderately sized backpack. Now we consider that unreasonable, right? So I would say programmability is definitely a thing. I would say like the ability to do smart contracts and operate, though the smart contracts thing kind of interacts with the like not being seizable space.
There seems to be an ever-growing long tail of coins, right?
Yeah.
There's no end. Is there some sort of, I can see where the mass public gradually gets more acceptance and recognizing certain of these coins, but then the net effect from more coins being added kind of confuses the marketplace. And so exerts some downward pressure on the recognizability and acceptability of some of these coins that are, especially newer coins.
Yeah.
Do you have anything to say about like the dynamic like that, where people in general become more acceptable, but then go to the marketplace and really have no idea of which coins to value?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's largely already happened, right? I would say that out of like, so I was like really fascinated by cryptocurrencies starting in like 2011, right? Me and my roommates, I've got these fascinating transaction logs where I like bought my roommate a sandwich for 3 Bitcoin, right? Yeah, exactly, by far, right? And vice versa. And back then it was like a really fairly navigable space in that sense. There was like 1 or 2 big ideas moving around, and you could kind of track it. At this point, I don't even pay attention to most of the cryptocurrency space because I can't, right? Like the signal has been buried in noise, right? It would be a full-time job. It would be more than a full-time job, right? You basically need a small institution to sort of sit through it. And I think that's roughly what you're talking about. So for me, it's all become unrecognizable except for like maybe the top 5 or 6, plus ones that people I personally know have created, right? So yeah, and I think that's a natural pattern, right? It's very similar to the stock market. Recognizability decays as the number of things go up, and the myth sort of gets spread out. I also think that, you know, you're going to see a tremendous shakeout when a lot of the sort of modern get-rich-quick myth goes away, because everyone's just sort of hoping to get lucky and get really rich by picking the lottery ticket.
I have to stop here, or you can just continue if you want to do the conversation. But yeah, we have some breaks, so those who do want to kind of take the break for toilet or whatever, feel free.
Okay, great. I really do want to get these next few questions going.
I wanted to ask about dollarization versus, so imagine you have an economy that has really bad hyperinflation or something.
Yeah.
Right now, or in the past 2 decades, the sort of elite switched to the dollar.
Right.
What would it take for them to, you said, why is the current method
So I would say 2 things, right? One, there's a massive technological overhead to using cryptocurrency. It's actually kind of messy and painful, and the acceptance is really low. So maybe, and then the second thing is basically comparative volatility, right? The US dollar is, in most people's head, incredibly stable, right? And all of the cryptocurrency space is incredibly volatile, right? So generally, if you're coming out of a currency that's volatile and dangerous, you're not going to flee into a currency that's volatile and dangerous. I think probably the thing that would cause that to happen would be for there to be a severe movement in the US dollar, probably a severe downward movement in the US dollar that sort of shook everyone's confidence in it, and then everything would flee into something else, and I think cryptocurrency would probably be a solid contender. I think the more people get into like the doomsday scenario space, the more they end up in cryptocurrency. And I'm so interested in your question, actually.
So that, I mean, I missed the first part, so I maybe you covered this, but this term value gets thrown around a lot in these scenes. And is often seen to be synonymous with the concept of price, and which I make a categorical distinction between these concepts. So when you say value, what exactly are you referring to in that particular context? So like, how do you conceive of value?
So
in relation to money.
I'm using that phrase in a incredibly loose way, especially as I speak kind of extemporaneously. I think you're totally right that it should be broken down into price and productive capacity, right? Like the ability for it to sort of produce coordinated effort in a useful way to the overarching society. I suspect that when I used it, I was going back and forth between price and usability, but I think mostly during this talk I was talking about price.
I think maybe it's the reason why it might be important is that a lot of these conversations about, a lot of money conversations have this assumption, and again I didn't see the list, but start from this idea that there's 3 functions of money, and then kind of like work back from that. And it's sort of just assume that these 3 functions exist. And often say like, if something fulfills those functions, then it is money. So the definition, you start off with this function, and then you kind of like say, well, therefore, if, for example, I use an Apple share to engage in a transaction, it's money.
Mm-hmm.
All right, but it's like, but what is Apple shares priced in? Apple shares are priced in US dollars. All right, so an Apple share is a derivative of another money system, So is that exactly the same as the money system? So it might do the same thing, but you have these kind of like layers of stuff. All those stable coins are all backed by some other thing. So like it's kind of like forming a consistent notion of what the actual layers of quote-unquote value are is quite important, I think. And I think in the cryptocurrency community in general, I think this issue isn't really described often. It's just like the mere fact of being able to sort of engage in a transaction with some kind of thing makes it money, even though it's dependent upon the underlying money systems to gain access to the actual physical goods and services.
Right. Yeah, no, I totally follow you. So that's also sort of an interesting conversation, which I was talking with Bretton about earlier, which is, you know, if it moves through other things to gain acceptability, right? If I can seamlessly trade my Bitcoin for US bank dollars, for regular dollars, and then for soda, is that really acceptable? Does that make Bitcoin acceptable money? That's an interesting question. As far as definition of money goes, I sort of, with most definitions, hold to a very kind of, I strongly accept semantic fuzziness, right? I think that we have a general pattern as humans in language to use things that mostly kind of match archetypes on a lot of vectors as like we say, okay, then that's kind of, this is kind of bird-shaped, so I'm going to call it a bird, right? And it has huge problems when you get down into scientific work, but it actually works pretty well, and I think is the underpinning of how language works as like a metaphor.
In money theory communities, you find this concept of moneyness,
yeah,
which is sort of like something that's kind of money-like, but isn't quite money, but sort of seems to operate in the same way. So, for example, like the repo markets or like US dollar bonds. I mean, what is a US bond? It's a promise of future money. But that bond in itself then becomes essentially can be used as money, so it's got like a moneyness to it.
Right.
So you could be arguing a lot of these things have certain forms of moneyness.
I would, yeah, that would be exactly what I'm arguing. I would argue that all of them have some level of moneyness, and I was sort of picking through ones that maybe don't, like diamonds kind of seem like they might have moneyness and are terrible, right? So I think actually that's what the spider chart is. It's like by area, I'm sort of trying to claim how much moneyness they have, and I think I'm also indicating that some of the canonical ones don't do that much better than some of the modern ones, but that's according to the criteria I just made up right now.
I think we're going to use the remaining 5 minutes for the change in the slides, but you guys can continue the conversation in the